A mountain man laughed at his $1 inheritance, until the very next day the judge drove him out to a hidden estate. The dusty street goes silent. A church bell tolls. A man who thought he had nothing suddenly stands before land stretching farther than the eye can see. But he isn't alone. A widow and her children already call it home. And in the shadows railroad men circle with forged papers and loaded guns. What looked like a worthless inheritance is actually a battleground of faith, family, and survival. Who truly owns the valley? The mountain man who bears the deed. The widow who guards her children. The fight for this $1 inheritance will cost blood, loyalty, and maybe redemption itself. And hearts. If values like respect, courage, and compassion still guide you, then you're part of this story. To dot through the morning mist, Jonah Cade guided his horse down the rocky trail from his line shack, his worn boots squeaking against the stirrups. The leather was cracking at the seams, another reminder of how things were wearing thin. He dug into his coat pocket, finding only a pinch of tobacco left at the bottom of his pouch. "Reckon we're both running low on supplies, old girl," he muttered. To his mare, patting her neck, the horse nickered softly in response. Her hooves picking carefully over the loose stones of the mountain path, the sun climbed higher as they descended, burning off the fog to reveal Leadville's muddy streets below. The town had grown since Jonah's last visit. With new buildings stretching out like wooden matchsticks against the mountainside, the clash of sounds grew louder as they approached the rowdy calls from the saloon, mixing with the gentle toll of church bells. Jonah's mare splashed through the muddy main street, her legs flecked with brown up to the knees. Outside the general store, he spotted Deputy Wilson, leaning against a post, thumbs hooked in his belt. "Cade," the deputy called out, straightening up. "Judge Whitcomb's been asking after you." Jonah's jaw tightened. In his experience, being summoned by any lawman rarely meant good news. "That's so?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral. "What's his honor? Want with the likes of me?" "Didn't say," Wilson replied. "Just told me to send you his way if I saw you." In town, with a resigned sigh, Jonah dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post. "Much obliged for the message," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. He took his time brushing the trail dust from his coat before heading toward the courthouse. The judge's office was dim, lit only by an oil lamp that cast dancing shadows on the wood-paneled walls. The smell of leather-bound law books and pipe, tobacco hung in the air. Judge Whitcomb sat behind his broad desk, his silver hair catching the lamplight. He was studying a piece of paper with more attention than Jonah thought any single sheet deserved. "Sit down, Cade," the judge said, without looking up, gesturing to the chair across from him. Jonah remained standing. "Rather hear what trouble I'm in while on my feet, if it's all the same to you." That got a chuckle from Whitcomb, dark red wax. "This came for you, from back east." Jonah took the envelope carefully, as if it might bite. The wax seal was impressed with a design he didn't recognize. "Who'd be writing me from back east?" "Open it and find out," Whitcomb suggested. Inside, his eyes moved slowly across the formal writing, brow furrowing deeper with each line. "No mistake," the judge replied. "Your uncle, Jerome Cade, passed away last month. Left you an inheritance, Uncle Jerome." Jonah's memory offered only the faintest image of a tall man with a handlebar mustache who'd visited once when Jonah was a boy, barely knew him. "Must be 20 years since I heard his name spoken. Nevertheless, you're his heir of record." Jonah scanned the document again. "Says here, the recorded value is $1. He threw his head back and let out a rough laugh that echoed off the office walls. $1? That's my grand inheritance. That's what's recorded. Yes, well, ain't this a fine fool's errand?" Jonah crumpled the paper slightly in his fist, or maybe the old man's final jab at the family black sheep. Judge Whitcomb leaned forward, his expression serious. "This is no joke, Cade. I'd like you to come back tomorrow morning. There's more we need to discuss." Without legal counsel, the judge's eyes remained steady. "Tomorrow morning, Cade, 9 o'clock. Jonah knew that tone. It wasn't a request. "Fine," he muttered, stuffing the letter into his coat pocket. "But I'm telling you, it's a waste of both our time." The sun was setting by the time Jonah found himself at Ma Peterson's boarding house, sitting alone at a corner table with a plate of beans and cornbread. The other boarders gave him a wide berth, which suited him fine. Some inheritance, he mumbled between bites, earning curious glances from nearby diners. $1 whole. Might buy myself a new kerchief, maybe even splash out on some penny candy. His harsh laughter drew more stares, but he ignored them later. Lying on a lumpy mattress under a roof that leaked whenever the wind blew from the west, Jonah stared at the water-stained ceiling. The inheritance letter was still in his coat pocket, probably getting crumpled beyond recognition. He didn't care. Come morning, he'd tell the judge thanks, but no thanks, and head back up to his line shack, where things made sense. Rain began to patter against the roof, and a drop of water landed on his forehead. Jonah wiped it away with the back of his hand and rolled onto his side. $1, he muttered into his pillow. Sleep came slowly, accompanied by the steady drip of water into a tin cup he'd placed on the floor too. Catch the leak. Pale morning light slanted across Leadville's muddy Main Street as the liquid was bitter and strong enough to strip paint just the way he liked it. Around him, the town stirred to life, shutters opening, shopkeepers sweeping porches, the blacksmith's hammer already ringing against iron. Rounded the corner, Judge Whitcomb handling the reins with practiced ease. The judge pulled up beside the boardwalk, his gray mare stamping her feet in the mud. "Morning, Cade," Whitcomb called out. "Hop in." Jonah stayed put, taking another sip of coffee. "Thought we were meeting at your office. Change of plans?" The judge's expression remained, patient but firm. "Your traps can wait. This can't." Finding none, he drained his coffee cup and stood with a sigh. "This better not be about that dollar inheritance. Just get in the buggy, son," muttering under his breath. Jonah climbed up beside the judge. Morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine from the mountains. They passed miners trudging toward the silver camps, picks and shovels slung over their shoulders. A few ranchers drove cattle along the road's edge, raising dust that settled on Jonah's coat. Outside the Methodist church, a young preacher in a black coat tipped his hat to passing townfolk. "Where exactly are we headed?" Jonah asked after they'd been rolling for nearly an hour. "Patience," was all Whitcomb would say. The sun climbed higher as they wound through the hills. Jonah recognized some landmarks, old lightning-struck pines and distinctive rock formations, but they were traveling a route he rarely took. After another hour, they began ascending a long ridge covered in scrub oak and juniper. Near the top, Whitcomb pulled the buggy to a halt. "There," he said, pointing to the valley below. "That's what your uncle left you." Jonah's first thought was that he was looking at nothing special. Just another hidden valley tucked between red rock cliffs and a grove of old cottonwoods. Then he noticed the details. Split rail fences running along the valley floor, though many rails had fallen. An orchard, wild and overgrown, its trees unpruned for years. And there, nestled against the valley wall, a ranch house with a roof that sagged like a tired horse. "I don't understand," Jonah said slowly. Whitcomb reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document. "This is the full deed. Your uncle recorded the estate's value as $1 to avoid drawing attention. The railroad's been buying up land. All through here, Jerome wanted to make sure it stayed in the family." Jonah took the deed with hands that weren't quite steady. The legal language swam before his eyes, but his name was clear enough. Along with the property description, 500 acres of valley and timber rights to the surrounding hills. Earlier, laughter was gone. Without a word, he climbed down from the buggy and started walking through the knee-high grass. Each step released the scent of sun-warmed earth and wild sage. He reached the corral, wrapping his hand around one of the rails. The wood was dry but solid beneath the weathered surface. A few apple trees had escaped the orchard's boundaries, their twisted branches reaching toward the sun. Beyond them, he could make out the remains of irrigation ditches that could be cleared and flowing again with work. The valley walls would shelter stock in winter, and that grove of cottonwoods meant water somewhere underneath. "Why me?" he finally asked, turning back to Whitcomb. Jerome had other kin back east. Your uncle watched this valley change over. 40 years, the judge said, saw what happened when city money moved in. Seemed to think you'd understand the land's worth beyond dollars and cents. Jonah stood silent, taking in the sweep of the valley. He'd spent so many years in his line shack, telling himself he preferred solitude. Now this place broken, but with bones of something greater, stirred memories he'd thought long buried. Of his parents' small farm before the fever took them. Of his brother Tom before the mine collapse. Of a time when he'd believed in more than just getting by alone. "I'll leave you to look around," Whitcomb said, gathering his reins. "Town's taking up a collection to rebuild the church roof next week. Might be good to have another property owner at the meeting." With a gentle slap of leather on Horsehide, he turned the buggy and started back toward Leadville. He found a creek running clear and sweet behind the cottonwoods. Old tools in a leaning shed, even a rusted wagon with serviceable wheels. As sunset painted the red rocks deeper crimson, he made camp near the main house, not quite ready to sleep. Under its uncertain roof, his small fire cast dancing shadows as he chewed on jerky and stared at the deed spread on his knee. $1. His uncle's clever trick to protect this hidden valley. The flames crackled, sending sparks up toward stars, just beginning to show through the darkening sky. Jonah thought about the work it would take to bring this place back. Mending fences, clearing ditches, fixing that roof. Thought about whether he was ready to be more than just a solitary mountain man with worn boots and empty tobacco pouch. The valley stretched quiet around him. Waiting for his decision, dawn painted the eastern sky in pale gold as Jonah rolled up his bedroll. The night's chill still clung to the air, making his breath visible in small clouds. He'd slept fitfully, dreams filled with visions of what this valley might become with work and time. Walking the property in the growing light, Jonah traced the remnants of old irrigation ditches that snaked through the tall grass. Years of neglect had filled them with silt and tumbleweeds, but their paths were clear enough. His uncle had known what he was doing. Channeling water from the creek to nurture crops and orchards, near a cluster of cottonwoods, he found a cracked wagon wheel, half buried in earth, its wooden spokes gray with age, but the iron rim still solid. "Might be worth saving," he muttered, marking its location in his mind. The orchard drew him next. Despite years without pruning, pink buds dotted the twisted branches. Apple trees, mostly, with a few pear and plum mixed in. The morning sun caught dewdrops on the new growth, making them sparkle like tiny gems. Even wild, these trees had refused to give up. His boots crunched on gravel as he approached the barn. The structure leaned slightly, its weathered boards silvered by sun and rain. Jonah reached for the door, noting the leather hinges would need replacing soon. As he pushed it open, the rusty screech of metal pins shattered the morning quiet. "Stop right there." The voice was firm, female, and backed by the unmistakable click of a rifle being cocked. Jonah froze, then slowly raised his hands, turning. Carefully, a Navajo woman stood in the barn's shadowed interior, rifle steady in her grip. Two children, a boy perhaps 10, and a girl a few years younger, peered around her long skirt. Their dark eyes watched him with a mixture of fear and curiosity. "Ma'am," Jonah said carefully, keeping his hands visible, "I mean no harm." "This is our home," she replied, her English clear and determined. "You have no business here." "Actually, I do." Jonah spoke slowly, conscious of the rifle's unwavering aim. "Name's Jonah Cade. My uncle Jerome left me this property. Got the deed yesterday from Judge Whitcomb himself." The woman's expression hardened. "I am Elena Yazzie. My husband worked this land for your uncle. Jerome promised us tenancy before. He died." Her grip tightened on the rifle. "We have nowhere else to go." "Ain't heard nothing about tenants," Jonah replied, a frown creasing his weathered face. "Judge didn't mention it neither." "The agreement was made in good faith," Elena insisted. "My husband helped plant these trees, built those irrigation ditches. Our children were born in that house." The boy stepped forward slightly, his small fists clenched. The girl clutched her mother's skirt tighter, dark eyes wide as she studied the stranger who threatened their home. "Look," Jonah said, slowly lowering his hands. "This is news to me, but threatening me with that rifle ain't gonna solve nothing." Their standoff might have continued longer, if not for the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Judge Whitcomb appeared. Around the barn's corner, his buggy raising dust in the morning light. "I had a feeling I should return early," the judge said, climbing down from his seat. He nodded to Elena. "Mrs. Yazzie, would you kindly lower that rifle? Mr. Cade here is indeed the legal heir, but I'm aware of your situation." Elena hesitated, then slowly lowered the weapon, though she kept it ready in her hands. "Now then," Whitcomb continued, "there's truth on both sides here. Jerome Cade did leave this property to his nephew, but he also made verbal agreements with Thomas Yazzie about tenancy. Until I can sort through Jerome's papers and find any written record, You both have partial claim to consider." Both Jonah and Elena spoke almost simultaneously, their tones equally disbelieving. "Both," the judge confirmed firmly. "Mrs. Yazzie and her children will continue living in the house. They've called home for years. Mr. Cade has the right to stay on his inherited property. I suggest you both find a way to make it work until this is settled properly." Neither party looked pleased with this arrangement, but the judge's tone left no room for argument. After ensuring there would be no further threats of violence, Whitcomb departed, leaving tension thick as storm clouds between the reluctant neighbors. Jonah led his horse to a distant cottonwood, tying it well away from the house and barn. He gathered dry branches and built a small fire, setting his battered coffee pot to boil. The familiar routine helped settle his thoughts as he considered this unexpected complication. Through the broken window of the house, he could see Elena moving about, helping her children with what appeared to be schoolwork at a rough-hewn table. Her posture remained rigid, proud, showing no sign of backing down from her claim to the land. The coffee pot began to bubble, its familiar aroma mixing with the scent of sage and spring grass. Jonah poured himself a cup, watching the sun climb. Higher over his inherited valley, a piece of land that was suddenly much more complicated than a simple dollar deed had suggested. As dusk approached, Elena gathered her children inside the house, the door closing firmly behind them. Jonah remained by his fire, both sides keeping their distance as shadows lengthened across the valley. Each contemplated their next move in this unexpected contest of claims and promises. While the ancient cottonwoods whispered secrets of the land's history in the evening breeze. Morning brought a gentle breeze across the valley as Jonah surveyed the barn's sagging frame. Several support beams had rotted through, leaving dangerous gaps in the structure. He spotted fallen timbers near the creek that might serve for repairs. Their wood weathered, but still solid. Sweat dampened his shirt as he dragged the first heavy log toward the barn. The work was familiar, reminding him of days spent maintaining his line shack. Through the house's open window, the smell of corn cakes drifted on the morning air. He caught glimpses of Elena moving about inside, her movements precise and deliberate as she worked at the wood stove. When their eyes met briefly, her gaze remained cold and distant. The sound of small boots scuffing dirt made Jonah turn. Elena's son stood a few paces away, watching with undisguised curiosity as Jonah positioned the timber against the barn wall. "Want to learn something useful, boy?" Jonah asked, keeping his voice gentle. The child hesitated, glancing back at the house before nodding slowly. "Here," Jonah said, holding out a hammer. "Hold it like this." He demonstrated the proper grip, noting how the boy's small hands wrapped carefully around the wooden handle. "That's right. Now watch how I set these nails." The boy's eyes widened with interest as Jonah showed him how to start a nail without smashing his thumb. A ghost of a smile crossed the child's face when Jonah let him try hammering one himself. "Thomas," Elena's sharp voice cut through the moment. "Come inside now." The boy quickly handed back the hammer and hurried toward the house, casting one last look over his shoulder at Jonah. Through the window, Jonah saw Elena pull her son close, her protective instinct clear in every movement. As afternoon faded, toward evening, Jonah shouldered his rifle and headed into the hills. The familiar rhythm of tracking helped clear his mind. When he spotted a young buck in a meadow above the ranch, his shot was clean and quick. He dressed the deer efficiently. Knowing fresh meat might serve as a peace offering, the sun was setting when he returned, laying a wrapped portion of venison on the house's front porch. He knocked once, then retreated to his camp beneath the cottonwood. Through the gathering dusk, he watched Elena open the door and study the offering. Several long moments passed before she picked up the package and carried it inside. Later, as Jonah stirred his coffee by the fire, footsteps approached. Elena stood at the edge of his firelight, holding a tin plate with several corn cakes and a portion of the cooked venison. "We cannot eat all of this alone," she said simply, setting the plate near his fire. "Thank you for the meat." Jonah nodded, accepting both the food and the small gesture it represented. Much obliged for the corn cakes. They shared a brief civil exchange about the weather and the condition of the orchard trees. Though tension still hung between them, its sharp edge had softened slightly. Elena soon returned to the house, where lamplight glowed warmly through the windows. As night deepened, Jonah leaned back against his saddle, gazing into the flames. Memories of his Uncle Jerome surfaced slowly, fragments of a visit long ago. When he was just a boy, he remembered a tall man with kind eyes who always seemed to have extra food for hungry neighbors. The way Jerome had spoken to everyone with equal respect, whether they were bankers or ranch hands, white or Indian. Inside the house, Elena's voice carried softly through the evening air as she tucked her children into bed. The musical cadence of Navajo prayer mixed with the crackling of Jonah's fire and the distant cry of a coyote. Both the widow and the mountain man looked up at the same star-filled sky, bound together by circumstance and the legacy of a man who had valued helping others. Above all else, Jonah was about to bank his fire for the night when movement caught his eye against the moonlit ridge to the west. Several riders moved slowly along the crest. Even at this distance, he could make out the glint of surveying equipment, chains, and transit instruments that marked them as railroad men. They worked methodically, taking measurements and marking positions as they went. A knot formed in Jonah's stomach as he watched them. He had seen this pattern before in other valleys, the quiet assessment that preceded steel rails and progress, regardless of who might stand in the way. His inheritance, he realized, might face threats more immediate than broken timbers and uncertain claims. The railroad men continued their work under the stars, unaware they were observed. Their presence cast a shadow longer than the moonlight, promising complications that neither Jonah nor Elena had anticipated. Valley floor, when the clatter of hooves broke the morning silence. Jonah looked up from his coffee to see 5 riders moving purposefully across the meadow, their saddlebags bulging with surveying equipment. A trimmed mustache directed the others with sharp gestures. They began hammering wooden stakes into the ground, working their way along the stream that fed the orchard. Jonah set his cup down hard enough to splash coffee on his boots. He strode toward the surveyors, his jaw set. "This here's private property," he called out, one hand resting near his belt. The well-dressed man turned his horse, revealing a polished badge on his vest. "Marcus Hale, Western Pacific Railroad," he announced with practiced smoothness. "And you would be Jonah Cade. This is my land, inherited legal and proper. Ah, Mr. Cade." Hale reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. "Perhaps this will interest you. The railroad has secured water rights to this stream and a 50-foot easement on either bank. All quite properly filed in Denver." His expression remained hard, but his stomach tightened. "These papers don't mean nothing without prior claim being respected." "The law disagrees, sir." Hale smiled thinly. "Progress cannot be impeded by unofficial arrangements." On the farmhouse porch, Elena stood watching, her hands gripping the railing. Her children pressed close to her skirts, eyes wide at the strangers. "The house, you'll find we have every right to survey this valley," Hale continued. "I suggest you study those papers carefully." He turned back to his men. Jonah stood rigid until the surveyors moved away, then stalked toward the house. Elena met him halfway across the yard, her face dark with anger. "So now you see," she said, her voice tight, "they will take everything just as they always do. Your paper claim means nothing to them." "Don't start," Jonah growled. Elena's laugh was bitter. "Like you alone can stop the railroad. My husband believed in papers and promises to now he lies in the earth, and still they come to take more." "This is different," Jonah insisted. "I've got legal right." "Legal right." She stepped closer, eyes flashing. "Tell me, what good is your legal right when they bring more men with guns, when they dam the stream that feeds these trees my husband planted? Will your paper stop them then?" Jonah opened his mouth to argue further, but was interrupted by the approach of a buggy. Judge Whitcomb pulled up, his expression grave as he took in the scene. "I came as quickly as I could." "They're claiming water rights," Jonah said, holding out Hale's document. Whitcomb adjusted his spectacles and studied the paper. "This is troubling, but not insurmountable. However, you must file a formal claim immediately. Jonah, the inheritance alone won't be enough. What about my husband's agreement? My daughter Sarah?" "Is searching the county records," Whitcomb replied gently. "If we can find documentation of your tenancy arrangement, it would strengthen the case considerably." But he hesitated. The strongest position would be a joint claim. United interests are harder to dismiss. Jonah and Elena exchanged wary glances. The idea of cooperation sat uneasily between them, like a wild horse not yet broken to the bit. "I'll consider it," Jonah said finally. "Consider quickly," Whitcomb advised. "Hale has a reputation for expedient methods. I've seen other properties lost while owners debated their options." He climbed back into his buggy. "I'll return tomorrow for your decision." The day passed in tense silence. Jonah split and sharpened fence posts, each strike of his axe echoing his frustration. The railroad men had moved to the far end of the valley, their presence a constant reminder of the threat. As evening approached, bringing mountain shadows and cooler air, small footsteps made Jonah look up. Elena's daughter stood nearby, a woolen blanket clutched in her arms. She held it out wordlessly. "Your ma send you with hers?" Jonah asked quietly. The girl shook her head. "I saw you shivering yesterday night." Her English was careful, clearly practiced. Jonah took the blanket, rough fingers brushing the soft wool. "Thank you, little one." She smiled shyly before running back to the house. His fire Elena approached, carrying a pot of stew. She set it down without ceremony. "We should talk." Jonah nodded, ladling portions into 2 bowls. They ate in silence for several minutes, watching sparks rise toward the stars. "With more than steaks and papers, I reckon so." Jonah set his empty bowl aside. "Your husband, what was he like?" Elena's face softened slightly. Strong, kind, he believed in building things that would last. She gestured toward the orchard. These trees were his dream, a place our children could grow like the saplings. Jonah studied the darkened grove, thinking of his uncle's letter. $1 and a valley of possibilities. "Dreams are worth protecting," he said quietly. They sat together by the fire, neither fully trusting yet, but feeling the first threads of understanding stretch between them. The ranch house loomed dark against the starlit sky, while in the distance, the surveyor's stakes stood like sentinels of change to come. Morning fog clung to the valley as Jonah climbed into Judge Whitcomb's buggy. The wooden wheels creaked under his weight, and the leather seat was cool with dew. He glanced back at the farmhouse where Elena stood watching, her shawl pulled tight against the dawn chill. "Mind the place," he called out gruffly. She gave a slight nod, then turned away. Judge Whitcomb clicked his tongue, and the horses stepped forward. The buggy rocked as it found the rutted trail leading toward Leadville. Jonah gripped the side rail, unused to riding in anything that wasn't a saddle. "Rough going," Whitcomb commented as they bounced through a washout. "But better than walking," Jonah grunted agreement. The morning sun slowly burned away the fog as they climbed out of the valley. Aspen leaves fluttered gold against the blue sky, and far-off peaks wore fresh snow like white caps. They rode in silence for several miles before Whitcomb cleared his throat. "Your Uncle Thomas was an interesting man," he said, adjusting the reins. "Came to see me about 6 months before he passed." Jonah shifted on the hard seat, barely knew him. "Met him once when I was knee-high to a grasshopper, but he knew you." Whitcomb's eyes remained on the trail. "Kept track of you over the years, asked about you whenever he came to town." "That's so," Jonah frowned. "What for?" He had his reasons. The judge guided the horses around a fallen branch. "You know, he could have sold that land for a fair price." Railroad men were sniffing around even then. But he was particular about who would inherit. Meaning what exactly? Whitcomb sighed. "He said you had a strong sense of right, even if you kept to yourself. Said you'd protect what mattered." He paused, including the people already living on the land. Jonah fell silent, letting the buggy's creaking fill the space. His uncle had chosen him specifically to protect Elena and her children. The thought sat uncomfortably in his chest. The sun was high when they finally reached Leadville. The street was busy with wagons and riders, dust rising in the late morning heat. They tied up outside the courthouse, a solid brick building that seemed to lord over the wooden structures around it. Inside, clerks shuffled through papers and scratched with steel pens. The deed filing took longer than Jonah expected, with multiple documents requiring his signature. His hand cramped from holding the pen. A well-dressed man watched from the corner, his eyes sharp above a neat beard. When Jonah finished the last paper, the man stepped forward. "Mr. Cade," he said smoothly, "I represent Western Pacific Railroad's legal interests. I feel obligated to inform you that we'll be contesting this claim." "Contest all you like," Jonah growled. Land's mine proper now." The lawyer's smile didn't reach his eyes. "We shall see what the courts say about that." He turned and left, his polished boots clicking on the wooden floor. Afterward, Jonah worked his way through the general store, filling a wagon Whitcomb had arranged. Nails by the pound, heavy sacks of flour and cornmeal, packets of vegetable seeds for the kitchen garden. The merchant's wife threw in a handful of peppermint sticks for them children. The sun was setting by the time they approached the valley. Again, long shadows stretched across the land, and the first evening star hung bright in the darkening sky. As they drew near the farmhouse, a sound caught Jonah's ear, singing. He climbed down from the buggy and walked closer, drawn by the melody. Through the window, lamplight spilled out into the gathering dusk. Elena sat in a wooden chair, her children on either side. Their voices rose clear and sweet in an old hymn Jonah half remembered from childhood. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. He stood in the shadows, something catching in his throat. The simple harmony spoke of hope and peace he'd long forgotten. Of family, of belonging. The song ended, and in the quiet, a floorboard creaked under his boot. Elena looked up, seeing him through the window. After a moment, she came to the door. "Need to talk," Jonah said quietly. She nodded and stepped outside. They walked a few paces from the house, where the children's voices drifted out as they prepared for bed. "Judge Whitcomb told me something today," Jonah began, "about my uncle. Seems he picked me special for this place." He scuffed his boot, and the dirt wasn't just about me having the land. It was about protecting what's already here. Who's already here? Elena said nothing, waiting. "Reckon he meant this place for all of us," Jonah continued. "Not just me, you and yours included." "And what do you think about that?" Her voice was careful, neutral. Jonah looked out over the darkened valley where coyotes had begun their evening songs. "Think maybe he was wiser than I gave him credit for." He turned back to her. "Railroads fighting the claim. Their lawyer made that clear today. They'll come at us hard." U.S. Elena raised an eyebrow. "Can't fight them alone," Jonah admitted. "Neither of us can." But together, he left the thought unfinished. Elena was quiet for a long moment. Finally, she spoke. "My people have a saying, a single stick may break, but a bundle holds strong." Jonah nodded slowly. "Reckon that's true enough." In the barn where he'd made his bed, Jonah listened to the night sounds of the valley. Coyotes called from beyond the orchard, their voices rising and falling like wild laughter. The old timbers creaked and settled, and somewhere an owl asked its eternal question of who. He thought of his uncle, a man he barely remembered, choosing him for this task. Thought of Elena and her children singing hymns by lamplight. Thought of the railroad men with their papers and promises. The night wind whispered through the gaps in the barn walls, carrying the scent of sage and approaching autumn. Jonah pulled his blanket closer and watched shadows dance on the rough-hewn beams above, wondering what tomorrow would bring. The next days flowed like the valley's stream, steady and purposeful. Morning light found Jonah hefting wooden posts and wire near the broken corral. His hands, more used to rifle and trapline, grew calloused in new places as he worked the land. From the corner of his eye, he watched Elena in her garden plot. She moved between the rows with practiced grace, tucking seedlings into dark soil. Her daughter followed, carrying a tin water can almost as big as herself, careful not to spill a drop. "Need more nails?" her son called out, holding up a loose board by the horse pen. The boy had taken to following Jonah around, eager to help with repairs. "Reckon we do," Jonah agreed, wiping sweat from his brow. "Fetch that bucket yonder." The morning passed in shared labor. Hammer strikes echoed across the valley while birds called from the cottonwoods. When the sun reached high, Elena's voice carried from the house, "Time to eat." They gathered around the worn table, passing cornbread and beans. The silence was different now, less brittle, more comfortable. Even the children seemed to feel it. Their shoulders relaxed as they spooned up their meals. After lunch, dark clouds began building over the western peaks. Jonah eyed them warily. "Storm's coming," he said, rising from the table. "Best secure things tight." Elena nodded, already moving to gather clothes from the line. The children ran to help, snatching sheets that snapped like sails in the rising wind. The first fat drops fell as Jonah climbed onto the roof. Loose planks rattled ominously beneath his boots. He worked quickly, hammering down what he could, while thunder rolled closer. "The shutters," Elena called from below. She was right. They were banging wildly against the house. Through the windows, he saw her wrestling with the heavy wooden panels, trying to latch them before the full force hit. The storm broke over them like a stampede. Rain sheeted sideways, and wind howled through every crack. Jonah scrambled to finish the roof, his clothes soaked through. Below, Elena fought her own battle with the shutters, bracing against the gale. Finally, the last plank was secured. Jonah half climbed, half slid down, landing in mud that splashed up to his knees. He hurried inside, where Elena had just finished. With the last shutter, they stood dripping on the plank floor, looking at each other's bedraggled state. Jonah's hat drooped like a wet sock. Elena's hair had come loose, plastered to her face. Something about their shared dishevelment struck them both at once, and unexpected laughter bubbled up. "You look like a drowned bear," Elena said, her eyes crinkling. "And you're not much better," Jonah retorted, but his grin took any sting from the words. The children giggled from their corner, and soon they were all laughing at the storm, at themselves, at the sheer relief of being safe and dry together. That evening, as rain drummed steadily on the newly secured roof, they gathered around the lamp. Jonah pulled out his pocket knife and a piece of pine, showing the boy how to whittle safely. "Always cut away from yourself," he instructed, demonstrating. "The motion, let the wood tell you what it wants to be." The boy's tongue stuck out in concentration as he tried to copy Jonah's movements. His sister watched intently, while Elena worked on mending by lamplight. "My Joseph would have enjoyed this," she said softly, her needle pausing. He loved working with his hands. Jonah looked up, surprised. It was the first time she'd spoken of her late husband without pain sharpening her voice. "Tell me about him," Jonah said quietly. Elena's hands resumed their steady motion as she spoke. "He had big dreams for this place. Said the orchard could feed half the valley if tended right. Wanted to plant more trees, build a proper irrigation system." She smiled faintly. "He would give away as much as he sold, go hungry when fruit hung heavy on the branches." The boy looked up from his whittling. "Papa used to lift me up to pick the highest apples." "That he did," Elena agreed, reaching out to smooth his hair. "He had a good heart, your father." Jonah studied this simple wooden figure taking shape under his knife. Something was shifting in his chest, like spring ice breaking up on a mountain stream. This wasn't just about duty anymore, or even about keeping his uncle's trust. This was about belonging to the land, to these people who were becoming more than just tenants to protect. The lamp burned lower, and Elena shooed the children off to bed. Jonah stepped outside to check the horses one last time before turning in. The storm had passed, leaving the air clean and sharp with pine scent. Movement caught his eye. Riders on the ridge. At this distance, he could see the rifles slung across their backs. The railroad men weren't just watching anymore, they were sending a message. Jonah's jaw tightened as he counted for mounted figures. They sat their horses like soldiers, not cowboys. Then, as if sensing his gaze, they wheeled and disappeared into the night. He stood for a long moment, listening to the drip of water from the eaves and the soft sounds of the settling house behind him. Everything they'd built here, everything. They were building together. It all hung by a thread. The railroad's patience was wearing thin, and soon they'd have to fight or lose it all. But that was tomorrow's worry. Tonight, the roof was sound, the children were safe in their beds, and somewhere in the darkness, an owl called out across the valley. They all called home. Dawn painted the valley in soft gold, but Jonah's mood was dark as the coffee he sipped. On the porch, the morning air still held storm dampness, and mist clung to the cottonwoods like ghost shapes. He had been up since first light, unable to shake the memory of those armed riders on the ridge. The crunch of hooves on gravel snapped his attention to the road. 5 riders approached, their horses picking a careful path through the muddy track. Even at a distance, sunlight glinted off gunmetal at their hips and rifle stocks. Elena, Jonah, called quietly through the door. "Get the children inside." She appeared beside him, took one look at the approaching men, and hurried back in. He heard her soft voice urging the children away from the windows. The riders pulled up in a semicircle before the porch. Their leader, the railroad foreman, Marcus Hale, sat straight-backed on a steel dust gelding. His clothes were town fancy, but his eyes were hard as canyon walls, beautiful. morning for business. Jonah set his coffee cup on the porch rail. Ain't much for business before breakfast. Oh, this won't take long. Hale reached into his vest and withdrew an envelope. Railroad's prepared to offer you $500 for this property. Clear title, no questions asked about current occupants. His gaze flicked to the window where the children's faces had been. Not interested. Jonah's voice was flat as prairie grass. 1,000 Den Hales. Smile didn't reach his eyes, more than generous for a broken-down homestead and some half-dead fruit trees. Jonah crossed his arms. This land ain't for sale, not at any price. Behind him, the door creaked open. Elena stepped out, her spine straight as a lodgepole pine. She had her children close, one on either side of her skirts, but her chin was lifted in quiet defiance. Hale's face hardened. Don't be a fool, Cade. You're new to these parts. Don't understand how things work. His hand rested casually near his holster. Progress is coming, whether you like it or not. Railroad needs this water rights, needs this pass. Only question is whether you profit from it or he let the threat hang in the morning air. I reckon I understand just fine, Jonah said. Understanding ain't the same as agreeing. One of Hale's men shifted in his saddle, hand tightening on his reins. The horses sensed the tension, stamping nervously in the mud. Last chance, Hale said softly. Take the money. Walk away clean. Jonah stepped forward, boot heels striking the wooden porch with deliberate force. This is my land. These are my people to protect. That's all the answer you're getting. He wheeled his horse, mud splashing from its hooves. Remember, I tried to be reasonable. The riders turned as one and trotted back toward the road. Just before they disappeared around the bend, Hale looked back. Silence settled over the homestead like dust after a storm. Jonah's shoulders remained tense, watching until the last rider vanished. Lord, he said, voice rough, but clear. I ain't much for praying. Reckon you know that. But I'm asking now for strength, not just for me, but for this family you've put in my care. Help me protect what's right. Amen. When he looked up, Elena was studying him with new eyes. The children had crept closer, their small faces solemn. Didn't know you were a praying man, she said quietly. Jonah shrugged. Haven't been, not since my brother died. But times like these, a man needs more than his own strength. The day passed in watchful tension. Jonah checked his rifle, cleaned his revolver, and positioned mirrors in the windows to catch lamplight and warn of night riders. Elena kept the children close, but went about her work with determined normalcy, kneading bread, teaching her daughter to sew, helping her son with his letters. As evening approached, Elena surprised Jonah by setting the table inside the house, not just for the children, but for him as well. The lamplight cast warm shadows on the walls, making the worn furniture seem almost rich. They sat together, passing cornbread and beans, the same simple fare made different by sharing it as family. The word rose unbidden in Jonah's mind, feeling both strange and right. Thank you, Elena said suddenly, breaking the quiet. Jonah looked up, questioning, for staying, for defending us. Her eyes met his steadily. You could have taken their money. Most would have. Most ain't been alone so long they forgot what matters, Jonah replied. He looked at each of them, the boy trying to sit tall like him, the girl sneaking bits of bread to her doll, Elena's face softened by lamplight. I mean to keep you safe, even if it costs blood. We pray it won't come to that, Elena said softly. Amen, Jonah agreed, and this time the word came easier. They finished the meal in companionable quiet. Outside, a whippoorwill called, and somewhere far off, a coyote answered. The children's eyes grew heavy, and Elena shooed them off to bed. With gentle words in Navajo, Jonah rose to take his usual place in the barn, but Elena's voice stopped him. There's a cot in the back room. Safer to have you close with she didn't finish, but she didn't need to. He nodded, touched by the gesture and what it meant. Trust. Finally given, the house settled around them like a nesting bird. Through the window, stars wheeled above. The valley, indifferent to the troubles of those below. But within these walls, something had shifted. They were no longer reluctant neighbors sharing disputed land. They were a family choosing to stand together. Come what may, both knew the railroad's next visit would bring violence, not words. But tonight, they had this moment of peace, fragile as new ice, precious as spring water, warm as the lamplight that held the darkness at bay. The valley settled into a gentle rhythm over the next 7 days. Each sunrise brought new purpose, and with it, the steady sound of hammers, saws, and hope building piece by piece. Jonah worked from dawn until dusk, his muscles aching with honest labor. The old homestead seemed to come alive under his hands, shaking off years of neglect like winter frost. He replaced rotted shingles one by one, the fresh cedar wood gleaming against the weathered roof. The scent of sawdust and pine tar filled the air as he worked, punctuated by the sharp ring of his hammer. Elena matched his industry, her strong hands clearing choked irrigation ditches and coaxing life back into the dormant garden beds. Her children trailed behind her like eager shadows, carrying small tools and learning the ways of the land. The boy, quick to smile now, proudly straightened nails for Jonah to reuse, while his sister scattered corn for the newly acquired chickens. "Reckon that's the straightest fence post in the territory," Jonah said one afternoon, stepping back to admire his work. The spring sun had burned his neck red, but satisfaction glowed brighter than any discomfort. Elena paused in her garden work, wiping soil from her hands. "It will last," she agreed, the ghost of a smile touching her lips. Like things built with care should, word spread through the scattered homesteads that Jonah Cade's inheritance was becoming something more than a broken-down claim. Neighbors began appearing first out of curiosity, then with genuine warmth. The Hendersons brought a milk cow, refusing payment. Old Jim Tucker rode up with a wagon of fence posts, claiming they were just taking up space in his barn. "Ain't seen this place so lively since your uncle's time," Tucker said, helping Jonah unload the posts. "Good to see lights in the windows again." Sarah Miller, whose ranch lay 3 miles east, arrived with her husband Tom and a basket of fresh eggs. "For the children," she said, but her eyes took in the newly repaired porch with approval. "Worth the art. Having a quilting circle next week, Ms. Yazzie. You'd be welcome." Each visitor seemed to leave something behind: a tool, a handful of seeds, a piece of advice about the orchards. More than that, they left the warm threads of community, weaving the isolated homestead back into the fabric of valley life. On Sunday morning, the Reverend Daniel Hayes guided his wagon up the rutted road, his white collar stark against his dusty black coat. Word had spread that he would hold service in the orchard, and wagons began arriving before the dew had dried. Families spread blankets between the ancient apple trees. His faith, like his social graces, had grown wild from neglect. But Elena's daughter tugged at his hand, pulling him toward where her mother had spread a quilt in the dappled shade. The Reverend's voice rose clear in the morning air, reading from a well-worn Bible. Though one may be overpowered, two can defend themselves. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken. The words settled into Jonah's heart like seed in fertile soil. He looked around at the gathered faces, neighbors who had become friends, strangers who had become neighbors. Elena sat beside him, her back straight. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound, voices blended, rough and smooth, young and old. Jonah didn't know all the words, but he found himself humming along, carried by the current of shared faith and fellowship. After the service, families lingered, sharing food and news. Children played tag between the trees while their parents talked of weather and crops and new calves. The valley felt alive with possibility, as if the music had awakened something long dormant. That evening, as the sun painted the western peaks in golden rose, they gathered for supper. The table, scrubbed to pale honey by Elena's careful hands, held a feast by their modest standards, fresh bread still warm from the oven, a roasted chicken fragrant with sage, early spring greens from the restored garden. Jonah carved the chicken with careful reverence, remembering other meals eaten alone in his lined shack or around cold campfires in the high country. This was different. This was home. The word rose in his mind like a prayer. The children chattered about their day, their earlier shyness around him long forgotten. The boy demonstrated how he had helped nail shingles using a piece of bread as his hammer. His sister carefully arranged her potatoes in the shape of a flower, making Jonah laugh despite himself. "More milk," Elena offered, and when she passed the pitcher, her fingers brushed his. The touch was brief as a butterfly's wing, but it sent warmth spreading. Through his chest, laughter came easier now, like a stream breaking free of winter ice. They talked of small things, tomorrow's weather, yet each word seemed to carry more weight, building something precious and new as the evening deepened. The girl child climbed into Jonah's lap, her small body heavy with sleepiness. He froze for a moment, uncertain, then carefully arranged his arms to cradle her. Her breath evened out into the peaceful rhythm of dreams. Looking up, he caught Elena watching them. A smile touched her lips, not the careful, measured expression he had grown used to, but something warmer. The boy nodding over his plate, the remnants of their shared meal. Through the window, stars were beginning to pepper the darkening sky. The same stars that had watched over his solitary camps for so many years now seemed to shine with new meaning. Jonah sat very still, holding the sleeping girl, afraid to break the spell of this moment. Here, in this kitchen that smelled of bread and coffee and hope, he had found something he hadn't known he was seeking. Not just shelter, not just purpose, but family, community, belonging. The word echoed in his heart like a bell. Home. The first light of dawn painted the eastern sky in gentle rose when the crack of gunfire split the morning silence. Jonah bolted upright from his bed in the barn, his heart hammering against his ribs. Through gaps in the weathered boards, he saw them coming, a dozen railroad men, their horses' hooves thundering across the valley floor. The lead rider was Marcus Hale, the railroad foreman, his face twisted with cruel determination. Before Jonah could reach his rifle, a bottle wrapped in oil-soaked rags sailed through the barn door, exploding in flames against a hay bale. Fire leaped hungrily up the dry wooden walls. "Get out here, Cade!" Hale's voice carried over the growing roar of flames. Jonah burst through the barn door, ducking as bullets splintered wood around him. He managed 3 steps before something hard struck his back, sending him sprawling into the dirt. Rough hands grabbed his shoulders, dragging him up only to slam rifle butts into his ribs. Pain exploded through his chest as he crumpled to his knees. Through blurred vision, he saw Elena at the house door, her children clutched close. "Run!" he tried to shout, but another blow caught him across the temple, filling his world with sparks of light and darkness. Elena didn't hesitate. She pushed her children toward the back door, away from the chaos. Bullets kicked up dust at their feet as they fled. The barn was fully engulfed. Now, orange flames reaching toward the morning sky. Jonah struggled to rise, earning another savage kick to his side. Through streaming eyes, he watched helplessly as the railroad men went about their destruction with methodical efficiency. They broke down the newly mended fences, posts splintering under their horses' weight. The grain they'd stored for planting was scattered to the wind, seeds glinting like tears in the strengthening sunlight. Their horses, good animals they'd only just acquired, were driven off, disappearing into the smoke-filled valley. Young trees that had just begun to bud caught flame, their branches becoming torches in the dry morning air. The fruit trees Elena's husband had planted, that they'd tended together these past weeks, crackled and burned. "Let this be a lesson," Hale said, crouching beside Jonah's battered form. "Clear out, or we'll bury you in this worthless dirt." The railroad men mounted up, their work done. They rode out as they had come, hard and fast, leaving destruction. In their wake, Jonah lay in the dust, each breath sending shards of pain through his chest. The morning sun climbed higher, watching through a veil of smoke as their dreams burned. Hours passed in a haze of pain and bitter failure. Jonah drifted in and out of consciousness, the taste of blood and ash thick on his tongue. Sometimes he heard voices, felt gentle hands trying to move him, but darkness kept pulling him under. When evening finally came, he opened his eyes to find himself on a bedroll inside what remained of the house. Half the roof was gone, open to the smoke-stained sky. His chest and face had been cleaned and bandaged, though every movement brought fresh waves of agony. Elena sat nearby, grinding herbs with steady movements. Her face was smudged with soot, her dress torn, but her hands remained gentle as she tended his wounds. The children huddled in a corner, unusually quiet, watching with wide eyes. "I'm sorry," Jonah whispered, his voice rough with smoke and shame. "I promised to protect you all, and I failed." Elena paused in her work, regarding him with eyes that held both sorrow and something stronger, in unbroken spirit that refused to be crushed. She didn't speak, but her silence carried its own kind of mercy. She simply continued her careful ministrations spreading healing poultices over his bruised flesh. Outside, the valley lay in ruins. The barn was nothing but smoldering timbers. Half the orchard was burned, the remaining trees standing like blackened sentinels in the gathering dusk. The air still tasted of smoke and violence, of promises broken and hope scattered like the lost grain. Jonah closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his failure press down harder than any physical pain. Everything they'd built together, all the progress of the past weeks, reduced to ashes in a single morning. The community they'd begun to create. The sense of belonging he'd finally found it, all seemed as fragile now as morning mist. "I've failed them all," he whispered again, words meant perhaps for himself, or for his uncle's memory, or for the God he'd only recently begun to trust again. The light faded from the sky, leaving them in the gray embrace of evening. Through the broken roof, the first stars appeared unchanged by the day's violence. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote cawed a lonely sound that seemed to echo the desolation in Jonah's heart. Morning sunlight filtered through the broken roof, rousing Jonah from his fevered sleep. Every breath brought sharp reminders of yesterday's beating. His ribs screamed as he pushed himself to sitting, head spinning from the effort. Bandages wrapped his chest and arms, Elena's careful work evident in their neat precision. The house was quiet. Through the shattered window, he could see the blackened skeleton of the barn against the sky. His good saddle tools, winter supplies all gone. The smell of wet ash and scorched wood hung heavy in the air, gritting his teeth against the pain. Jonah pulled himself to his feet. The room tilted dangerously, but he steadied himself against the wall. Each step was agony, but determination drove him forward. He had to see the full extent of their loss. The door creaked as he pushed it open. Morning light revealed the devastation in stark detail. Broken fence posts jutted from churned earth like snapped bones. The storage shed gaped empty, their precious seed grain scattered and ruined. Half the orchard stood charred, young trees reduced to black stumps reaching toward heaven. Rage boiled up in Jonah's chest, hot and bitter as bile. His hands clenched into fists, splitting scabs and bringing fresh pain. All their work, all their hope destroyed in one brutal morning. He wanted to scream, to curse God and man alike, but his throat closed around the fury. The children asked, "If you would live," Jonah turned carefully. Elena stood in the doorway, her face drawn with exhaustion. She had been up through the night, tending his wounds, comforting her frightened children. "Maybe it would have been better if I hadn't," he said roughly. "Everything's gone. The barn, the grain, half the orchard. Even if we replanted today, we couldn't harvest enough to last the winter. So you give up." Elena's voice carried an edge. "Hand victory to the railroad men who burned our home." Our home. Jonah laughed bitterly, immediately regretting it. As pain lanced through his ribs, "Look around, woman. There's nothing left to call home. I was a fool to think I could protect this place, protect your family. Best thing I could do now is ride away. Let you make peace with the railroad before worse comes." "Peace." Elena stepped closer, her eyes flashing. "You think they offer peace? They offer surrender, death by inches instead of bullets. My husband believed in this land, your uncle believed. Now you stand in ashes and think only of running." Her words struck deeper than the railroad men's blows. Jonah looked away, unable to meet her gaze. His horse was still there, grazing in the far pasture. He could be gone by nightfall, find some new mountain valley, return to his solitary life. The thought tasted like ash in his mouth. The day passed slowly. Elena and the children cleared debris. Jonah watched, useless in his injuries, shame burning hotter than his pain. As sunset painted the smoke-stained sky, neighbors arrived with food and offers of help. Jonah withdrew to the house, unable to face their pity or kindness. Night settled. Over the valley, the children slept on their pallet, exhaustion finally claiming them. Jonah sat by the broken window, staring at nothing, when Elena's soft voice broke the silence. "My grandmother's grandmother lived in a valley like this. She began settling nearby with her mending. When soldiers came, they burned everything, drove the people out, marched them far from their homes. But some returned, not with weapons or anger, but with prayers and patience. They planted corn in the ashes, sang songs to the rain, rebuilt, with faith instead of fear. Her needle flashed in the lamplight as she worked. The land remembered them. Springs that ran dry began to flow again. Seeds sprouted in the burnt earth. Slowly, through many seasons, life returned. Not because they were strong, but because they believed in something larger than themselves. Jonah felt moisture on his cheeks, realized he was weeping, not from pain or rage, but from something deeper recognition of his own prideful blindness. He had thought only of possession, of proving himself, of winning. But the land, this valley, these people, they needed something more than his stubborn pride. "My husband died believing in this place," Elena continued softly. "Not just the soil or trees, but what it could become, a home for our children, a place where different peoples could live together, share the Creator's gifts. Your uncle saw the same vision. That is why he chose you, Jonah Cade. Not for your strength, but for the heart he knew was hiding beneath all that mountain man pride." The truth of her words undid him completely. Jonah slid from his chair to his knees, ignoring the protest of his injuries. There, in the ashes of their burned home, he bowed his head and prayed. Not for revenge or victory, but for renewal, for wisdom to see beyond his own wants, for faith to match the quiet strength of the woman watching over him. His whispered words filled the darkness. "Lord, help me be worthy of this land, these people. Show me the way to rebuild, not just walls and fences, but trust and hope. Let me learn to serve instead of possess. And forgive my blindness, my selfish pride." Elena's hand touched his shoulder, gentle as morning light. Together they knelt in the ashes of what was lost, while somewhere in the darkness, springs continued to flow. Seeds waited to sprout, and tomorrow waited to be born. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley as Jonah eased himself into Judge Whitcomb's buggy. His ribs still ached from the railroad men's beating, but determination pushed him through the pain. The judge clicked his tongue, and the horse set off at a steady pace toward town. "You're certain about these papers?" Jonah asked, holding tight as they bounced over a rut. "The ones showing my uncle meant to protect Elena's family." Whitcomb nodded, his weathered face thoughtful. "I remember when he filed them. Your uncle was particular about the wording. Wanted it clear that whoever inherited would have to honor the tenancy agreement with the Navajo families working the land." The buggy rattled past newly built homesteads and tired mining claims. Jonah's mind wandered back to the valley, where Elena and her children were salvaging what they could from the railroad's destruction. The thought of them working alone made his jaw clench. "Railroads got money for fancy lawyers," Jonah muttered. "What chance do we have against their kind of power?" "Truth's got its own power," Whitcomb replied, steering around a deep hole in the road. "Sometimes it just needs the right moment to shine through." They reached Leadville by mid-morning. The streets were busy with wagons and riders, dust rising in the crisp mountain air. Outside the courthouse, well-dressed men in dark suits clustered. Around Marcus Hale, the railroad foreman, their fancy boots had never seen honest work, Jonah noted with disgust. Inside, the clerk's office smelled of ink and old paper. Railroad lawyers spread documents across the broad desk, their confident smiles suggesting victory was already certain. Hale stood behind them, arms crossed, watching Jonah with barely concealed contempt. "These deeds clearly show the railroads prior claim to water rights," one lawyer announced, pointing to elaborate stamps and signatures. "And these establish our authority to clear squatters from the proposed rail line." Jonah's fists clenched at the word squatters, but Judge Whitcomb laid a calming hand on his arm. The old judge stepped forward, pulling a leather folder from his coat. "Interesting documents," Whitcomb said mildly. "But I believe you'll want to examine these first." He carefully extracted several yellowed papers, smoothing them on the desk. The original deed and tenancy agreement, filed 15 years ago by Theodore Cade. The lawyers crowded forward, their confidence wavering as they studied the documents. Jonah moved closer, seeing his uncle's familiar signature at the bottom of each page. The legal language was complex, but certain phrases stood out clearly. Perpetual tenancy rights, Navajo families, binding upon all heirs and successors. Hale shouldered through, his face darkening as he read. These could be forged. He snapped. Convenient timing, finding them now. The clerk, A thin man with ink-stained fingers adjusted his spectacles. "These bear the county seal and my predecessor's signature. I remember when they were filed caused quite a stir at the time. A white rancher explicitly protecting Indian tenancy rights. The law is clear on this," Whitcomb added. "These documents take precedence over any subsequent claims. The railroad can't simply seize land where prior legal agreements exist." One of the lawyers whispered urgently to Hale, whose face had turned an ugly shade of red. "This isn't over," he growled, gathering his papers. "We'll present our full case next week." "Yes, we will," Whitcomb agreed pleasantly, "in open session where everyone can hear the evidence. Thursday morning, I believe." The clerk nodded, making a note in his thick ledger. Thursday at 9 o'clock, full hearing before the county commission. Jonah watched the railroad men storm out, their boot heels clicking angrily on the wooden floor. His heart was pounding, but not from fear this time. For the first time since the attack, he felt hope rising in his chest. "Your uncle was a smart man," Whitcomb said as they walked back to the buggy. "He knew someday someone would try to push his tenants off the land, so he made sure the law would protect them." The ride home seemed shorter despite the afternoon heat. Jonah's mind was already racing ahead, planning repairs to the barn, thinking how to restore the irrigation ditches before the summer ran too far along. They crested the final ridge, just as sunset painted the valley in gold. Smoke no longer rose from the ruins of the barn, and Jonah could see new fence posts standing straight where the old ones had been broken. Even from a distance, signs of renewal were visible. Whitcomb pulled the buggy to a stop near the house. "The hearing won't be easy," he warned. "Railroad lawyers are clever, and they play rough, but we've got truth on our side, and sometimes that's enough." Jonah climbed down carefully, his ribs reminding him to move slowly. "Much obliged, Judge, for everything." "Thank your Uncle Whitcomb," replied with a small smile. "He's the one who made sure justice had a chance here." With a touch of his hat brim, he turned the buggy and headed back toward town. The sun was setting as Jonah walked toward the house. Through the open door came the sound of singing Alina's clear voice leading her children in a hymn he recognized. From his own childhood, the words spoke of hope and God's faithfulness in times of trouble. Near the porch, an old wagon wheel lay propped against a post. Jonah had been meaning to fix it before the railroad's attack. Now, listening to the hymn floating out into the evening air, he gathered his tools and sat down to work. The children's voices grew stronger as they learned the words, their mother patiently teaching verse by verse. Jonah's hands moved steadily, replacing broken spokes, tightening the iron rim. The simple work felt like a prayer itself, an act of faith that tomorrow would be worth preparing for. As darkness settled over the valley, the hymn's final notes echoed off the rocky walls that cradled their small homestead. Jonah paused in his work, letting the peace of the moment wash over him. The wheel wasn't finished, but like their fight for justice, it was well begun. Inside, a lamp glowed warmly. Elena stood in the doorway, her children beside her, watching him work with quiet approval. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they had music and hope, and the strength that comes from standing together against wrong. The evening star appeared above the valley rim, bright and steady. From somewhere in the darkness came the soft call of a mourning dove, its gentle voice carrying another kind of music across the cooling air. Jonah worked on marking time with each careful hammer stroke, while all around him the valley held its breath. Waiting for justice to unfold, dawn painted the valley walls gold as Jonah hitched the horses to Whitcomb's borrowed buggy. His movements were quick but careful, each motion betraying the tension coiled inside him. The hearing was 3 days away, and already the railroad's shadow had grown darker. He glanced toward the house where Elena was gathering the last of their things. Through the window, he could see her folding clothes into a worn carpet bag. Her children helping with solemn faces, they understood more than children should have to. The crunch of approaching hooves made Jonah's hand drift to his holster. He relaxed slightly when he recognized Sarah Whitcomb riding up the path, her school satchel bouncing against her saddle. "Thought you might need these," she called, dismounting gracefully. She pulled several papers from her bag. "Father asked me to bring the witness statements from the neighboring ranches. He says to keep them safe until the hearing." Jonah took the documents, noting the careful signatures of folks who'd seen the railroad men's destruction firsthand. "Much obliged, Miss Sarah, though these roads ain't exactly safe for riding alone these days." Sarah's chin lifted. "I noticed 2 men were watching the South Road when I passed. They didn't look friendly." "Railroad scouts," Jonah muttered. He tucked the papers into his coat. "They've been getting bolder," as if to emphasize his words. A distant gunshot echoed off the valley walls. Probably just someone hunting, but the sound made them all tense. Elena appeared in the doorway, her face tight with worry. "The children are ready." She carried her carpet bag in one hand, her other resting protectively on her daughter's shoulder. Her son followed, clutching a small wooden horse Jonah had carved for him. Sarah stepped forward to hug them both. "Oh, keep an eye on things here while you're gone. Father has some of the deputies watching too." Jonah helped Elena and the children into the buggy, then climbed up himself. The worn leather seat creaked beneath them as he gathered the reins. "We'll take the back way through Carson's Pass," he said quietly. "Longer route, but fewer places for ambush." They set out as the sun cleared the eastern ridge. Sarah's horse kicked up dust as she rode ahead to check the road. The buggy wheels rattled over rocks and ruts, each bump making them more aware of their vulnerability. Around mid-morning, they found the first roadblock. A massive pine had been felled across the narrow track, its branches splayed like grasping. Fingers, fresh axe marks, showed in the trunk. "Railroad work?" Jonah spat, examining the cut. "They're trying to keep us from reaching town." It took an hour to clear enough space to squeeze the buggy past. Jonah's shirt was soaked with sweat by the time they continued, and precious time had been lost. They ate a cold lunch in the buggy, not daring to stop. The second obstacle came at Weber Creek. Someone had slashed the rope bridge that spanned the gorge, leaving the hemp strands dangling uselessly. They were forced to backtrack 5 miles. "To find another crossing. They're everywhere," Elena said softly as they forded the shallow water. "Like coyotes circling." Jonah nodded grimly. "They want us to give up before we reach town." He glanced back at her. "We won't." The afternoon sun was sinking when they finally reached Leadville's outskirts. Signs of the railroad's intimidation were clear here too. Fresh bullet holes pocked, the welcome sign, and several wagons sat with slashed tires in front of the general store. The Golden Rose boarding house stood 3 stories tall on Cedar Street, its yellow paint faded but clean. Mrs. Peterson, the owner, met them at the door. With keys and concerned looks, Judge Whitcomb arranged everything, she said, leading them upstairs. 2 connecting rooms on the backside, away from the street. "I'll bring up supper myself." The rooms were small but tidy, with iron beds and faded quilts. A door between them would let Elena and her children sleep separately while staying close. Jonah set their bags down, then moved to check the window views and fire escape. "Try to rest," he told Elena. "I'll keep watch." But rest proved elusive. As darkness fell, the children grew restless, jumping at every sound from the street below. Elena's daughter especially seemed unable to settle, her eyes wide and frightened in the lamplight. "Come here, little one," Jonah said finally, patting the chair beside him. "Let me tell you about the time I met the bravest mountain lion in Colorado." The girl crept closer, curling into the chair as Jonah began his tale. Now, most folks think mountain lions are just big cats, but this one was different. She had 2 cubs to protect, you see, and that made her braver than any beast I'd ever met. He wove the story carefully, speaking of how the mother lion faced down a pack of wolves to defend her young, how she never backed down despite being outnumbered. "Sometimes," he said softly, "being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you keep going anyway, because what you're protecting matters more than fear." The girl's eyes were growing heavy by the time he finished. Elena, who had been listening from the doorway, came to carry her to bed. "Thank you," she whispered as she passed. Jonah nodded, throat tight. He moved to the window, watching the darkened street below. A few doors down, light spilled from the telegraph office where the operator's key clicked steadily. Shortly before midnight, the clicking grew more urgent. 2 men emerged from the saloon across the street, heading quickly toward the office, even in the dim light. Jonah could see the operator's hands moving rapidly over the key. Hale and his companion crowded close, reading the incoming message. Whatever news it brought made Hale smile. a cold expression that set Jonah's nerves on edge. The men spoke briefly. Then Hale produced paper and pencil, scratching out a reply. The operator began sending it immediately, his key chattering in the night. Orders being sent up the line, Jonah thought grimly, the railroad preparing its next move. He touched the revolver at his hip, checking its familiar weight. The smooth, wooden grip had been worn by years of use, but the action was clean and sure. He had cleaned and loaded it carefully before leaving the valley, though he prayed it wouldn't be needed. Across the street, Hale and his man emerged from the telegraph office. They paused beneath a lamppost, heads close in conversation. Hale's voice carried faintly through the night air. "By any means necessary," he was saying. "The board won't tolerate delays. If the hearing goes against us, the rest was lost as they moved away." But Jonah had heard enough. He watched until they disappeared around the corner, then checked. The window locks again. In the connecting room, he could hear Elena humming softly to her children, a quiet Navajo melody that spoke of strength and endurance. Jonah settled into a chair by the door, his revolver close at hand. The night stretched ahead, full of shadows and unseen threats, but they had come too far to turn back now. Whatever the railroad planned, they would face it together. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking time until morning. Until the hearing that would decide not just ownership of a valley, but the fate of a family. Jonah's family, he realized with sudden clarity, not by blood, but by choice and conviction. He touched the witness statements in his coat pocket, feeling the weight of neighbors' trust. Below, a dog barked in the darkness, and somewhere, a train whistle wailed like a distant warning. Jonah kept his vigil, watching through the night as Leadville's streets grew quiet, waiting for whatever dawn would bring. Morning light streamed through the courthouse's tall windows, casting long shadows across the worn floorboards. The room buzzed with whispered conversations as townspeople filed in, filling the wooden benches until they creaked under the weight. Judge Harrison, a stern-faced man with silver temples, adjusted his spectacles at the high desk while clerks shuffled papers below. Jonah sat rigid beside Elena in the front row, his Sunday coat feeling too tight across his shoulders. Her children nestled between them, quiet and solemn in their best clothes. Behind them, Judge Whitcomb leaned forward, his weathered hands clasped around a leather document case. The railroad's table fairly gleamed with polished briefcases and stacks of official-looking papers. Marcus Hale sat smugly beside his lawyer, Edward Pinkerton, a thin man whose gold watch chain glinted as he arranged documents with manicured fingers. "All rise," the bailiff called out. The assembled crowd stood as Judge Harrison settled into his chair, the leather creaking softly. "We're here today regarding ownership claims on the Patterson Valley estate," Judge Harrison began, his voice carrying to the rafters. "Railroad interests versus the inheritance claim of Jonah Cade, with additional consideration for existing tenancy rights. Mr. Pinkerton, you may present your case." The railroad lawyer rose smoothly, adjusting his silk vest. "Your Honor, this is a simple matter of progress and proper documentation. The Denver and Rio Grande Railroad has legitimate purchase agreements for the water rights and right-of-way through Patterson Valley." Signed and notarized, he lifted a sheaf of papers. "These documents clearly show those papers are forged." Jonah growled under his breath. Whitcomb's hand settled on his shoulder, steadying him. Pinkerton continued for nearly an hour, painting a picture of railroad prosperity bringing civilization to the frontier. His words dripped with false concern for progress, for the greater good that would come from laying steel rails through the valley. He produced deed after deed, survey after survey, each one suggesting the railroad's claim superseded all others. "Furthermore," Pinkerton said with a dismissive glance toward Elena, "any informal arrangements with local residents were clearly temporary in nature. The railroad cannot be bound by casual promises made without proper authority." Jonah's hands clenched until his knuckles went white. Beside him, Elena sat straight-backed, her dignity a quiet rebuke to Pinkerton's sneering tone. And now, Pinkerton concluded with a flourish. "Mr. Cade presents a dubious $1 inheritance claim, clearly a clerical error or joke. While these squatters cling to unsubstantiated verbal agreements, the railroad's position is clear. We have legal right to proceed with construction as planned. "Thank you, Mr. Pinkerton," Judge Harrison said. "Judge Whitcomb, you're representing Mr. Cade's interests." Whitcomb rose slowly, his worn boots scuffing the floorboards. Unlike Pinkerton's practiced smoothness, the old judge's movements carried the weight of decades serving frontier justice. He placed a single leather folder on the desk before him. "Your Honor, I'd like to present the original deed to Patterson Valley, filed by Theodore Cade 15 years ago." Whitcomb's voice was quiet but firm. "It has remained sealed in county records, until now, with specific instructions for its execution upon his death." The courthouse fell silent as Whitcomb carefully broke the wax seal. The crack echoed off the high ceiling. Even the children seemed to hold their breath as he unfolded the yellowed paper. "Theodore Cade's will is quite specific," Whitcomb continued. "The entire estate, including water rights and all improvements, passes to his nephew Jonah Cade, but with a binding condition that forms the core of the inheritance." He lifted the document, sunlight illuminating the careful penmanship. I quote, "Directly to my nephew Jonah Cade, I leave my earthly estate in Patterson Valley, valued at $1 in legal recording, to protect it from speculation and seizure. This inheritance carries a sacred obligation, the protection and preservation of tenancy rights granted to the family of James Yazzie, whose people knew this valley's worth long before any deed was written. This land shall be held in shared stewardship, joining to peoples in common cause." As God intended his children to live, a murmur rippled through the courthouse. Jonah felt something catch in his throat as his uncle's words hung in the air. Beside him, Elena's hands trembled slightly as she pulled her children closer. "The document is properly witnessed and notarized," Whitcomb said, passing it to the judge. Theodore Cade's intention could not be clearer. The $1 valuation was a deliberate strategy to prevent exactly the kind of speculation and seizure the railroad now attempts. Pinkerton shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is absurd. A property can't be intentionally undervalued to avoid proper transfer. And these provisions about native tenancy rights are not legally binding." "On the contrary," Whitcomb replied calmly, "the territory's own statutes, Section 12, Paragraph 4, explicitly protect inheritance conditions regarding existing tenant relationships. Theodore Cade's will simply formalize an arrangement already recognized by neighbors and community members for years." Judge Harrison studied the document carefully, holding it up to the light. The filing, dates, and seals appeared genuine. "Pinkerton, these predate your railroads, claimed purchases by several years." "But, Your Honor," Pinkerton sputtered, his composure cracking, "surely the needs of progress, of civilization itself, cannot be built on false deeds and broken promises." Judge Harrison cut in sharply, "I've seen enough. This court finds Theodore Cade's will valid and binding in all particulars. The Patterson Valley estate passes to Jonah Cade, with all rights and obligations regarding the Yazzie family's tenancy to be honored in perpetuity. The railroad's claims are hereby declared void and without merit." He struck his gavel once, that cracked like summer thunder in the hushed room. For a moment, no one moved, then a cheer went up from the gathered townspeople. Jonah found himself standing, though he couldn't remember rising. His hand found Elena's and squeezed gently, her fingers wrapped around his warm and strong. "We did it," he whispered hoarsely. "The valley is safe." Elena's eyes shone with unshed tears as she nodded. Her children hugged her skirts, not fully understanding, but feeling the joy in the room. Marcus Hale stormed out, shouldering roughly. Past onlookers, his face was dark with rage as Pinkerton hurried after him, gathering scattered papers. "This isn't over," he snarled at Jonah. "The railroad doesn't forget its enemies." But his threats were drowned out by the crowd's celebration. Farmers, ranchers, and shopkeepers pressed forward to shake Jonah's hand and pat his shoulder. Women clustered around Elena, offering congratulations and welcomes long overdue. "Well done, son," Whitcomb said quietly, clasping Jonah's arm. "Your uncle would be proud. He knew you'd understand eventually that land isn't just something to own, but something to protect and share." Outside the courthouse, autumn sunlight bathed the street in gold. Townspeople gathered in knots, talking excitedly about the victory. Children ran playing between the adults, while women shared fresh-baked bread and men passed around congratulatory cigars. Jonah stood on the courthouse steps, watching Elena's daughter twirl in circles, her joy too big to contain. The little Boy was showing his wooden horse to other children, proudly telling them about his home in the valley. "What happens now?" Elena asked softly, coming to stand beside him. Jonah looked out over the town, toward the distant hills where their valley waited. "Now we build something new," he said. Together, Sarah Whitcomb appeared with a basket of food for their journey. "Home? The whole town's talking about coming out Sunday next for a celebration," she said brightly. "A proper welcome for everybody." More townspeople came forward with offers of help: seeds for spring planting, spare lumber for rebuilding, hands willing to work. The railroad's threats of vengeance seemed to fade in the face of community drawing together, choosing what was right over what was profitable. The sun was past noon when they finally loaded the buggy for the ride home. Tired, but happy, full of fresh cookies from the baker's wife. As Jonah helped them up into the seat, he caught sight of Marcus Hale and his men mounting up at the livery stable, their dark looks promising future trouble. But that was a worry for another day. Right now, the valley waited, and with it, the promise of new beginnings. Jonah clucked to the horses, and the buggy rolled forward into the golden afternoon. Carrying its passengers home to the land they had won together, the journey home from town felt different. Jonah sat tall in the wagon seat, the afternoon sun warm on his shoulders as they crossed the familiar ridge overlooking Cottonwood Valley. Beside him, Elena held the reins steady while her children dozed in the wagon bed, exhausted from the excitement of their courthouse victory as they descended into the valley. Jonah's heart caught at the sight of their burned barn and scorched orchard trees. But something else caught his eye: a line of wagons winding up the valley road, dust rising behind them like a banner of hope. "Look there," he said softly, pointing. Elena pulled the wagon to a halt, her eyes widening. At least a dozen families were making their way toward the homestead, their wagons piled high with lumber, tools, and supplies. Leading them was Judge Whitcomb's buggy, Sarah Whitcomb's blue bonnet visible beside him. The whole town must have followed us home. Jonah marveled. Elena's children stirred awake, sitting up to watch the approaching wagon train. Little Mary clutched her mother's skirt. "Are they coming to help us, Mama?" "Yes, my love," Elena's voice was thick with emotion. "They are coming to help." By the time Jonah and Elena reached the homestead yard, the first wagons were already circling up. Men jumped down, rolling up their sleeves, while women unpacked baskets of food, and children ran to gather kindling for cooking fires. "Thought you might need a hand," old Pete Henderson called out, already unloading fresh-cut timber from his wagon. Brought enough lumber to raise that barn proper this time. Sarah Whitcomb hurried over, hugging Elena. "We've all brought something: seeds, livestock, preserves." Everyone wanted to help make things right. Jonah stood speechless, watching as more neighbors arrived. The Miller boys led a small herd of cattle replacement stock for what the railroad men had stolen. The Watson family brought wooden fence posts and rolls of wire. Even the widow Thompson had come, her wagon loaded with apple saplings to restore the burned section of orchard. "Well, don't just stand there gawking," Judge Whitcomb said, clapping Jonah on the shoulder. "There's work to be done before sundown." The valley came alive with purposeful activity. Men gathered in teams to begin clearing the burned barn ruins, while others marked out the foundation for the new one. Women set up an outdoor kitchen, the smell of coffee and baking bread soon filling the air. Jonah found himself working alongside neighbors he'd barely spoken to before, sharing tools and stories as they labored. The minister's son showed him a faster way to notch logs. Tommy Watson's wife taught Elena her secret for keeping seedlings strong through early frost. By midday, the new barn's framework was rising against the sky. Jonah worked with the others, driving nails and raising beams, his shirt dark with honest sweat. He kept finding his gaze drawn to Elena, who moved among the workers with grace, offering water and thanks. Their eyes met across the busy yard, sharing quiet smiles that held growing warmth. The children were everywhere at once, running errands and carrying tools. Young Joseph worked proudly alongside the men, while Mary helped the women sort seeds. For replanting, their laughter rang out frequently, a sound that made the valley feel more like home with each passing hour. When the sun reached its peak, Sarah Whitcomb rang the dinner bell. Everyone gathered in the shade of the surviving cottonwoods, sharing a feast of contributed dishes: fresh bread, cold chicken, preserves, and pies. Jonah found himself seated between Elena and Pete Henderson, passing plates and joining easily in the conversation. "Remember when your uncle first came to this valley?" Pete asked, buttering a thick slice of bread. "Wasn't much here but sage and rattlesnakes. But Thomas, he saw something more. Said this land needed people working together to make it bloom." Jonah nodded, understanding his uncle's vision more clearly now. Seems he was right about that. After the meal, work resumed with renewed energy. The irrigation ditches that had run dry were cleared and strengthened. Fresh seedlings went into turned earth, each one a promise of future harvests. The new barn grew steadily skyward, its solid beams a testament to shared purpose. As afternoon, shadows lengthened, more neighbors arrived, bringing supplies for an evening gathering. Lanterns were strung between the trees, their gentle light mixing with the golden sunset. Someone brought out a fiddle, and soon music floated across the yard. Jonah paused in his work, watching as children chased fireflies and women laid out supper on makeshift tables. The valley felt different, no longer a lonely inheritance, but a place of belonging. He saw Elena moving through the crowd, her face softened by lamplight, and felt something shift in his heart. When darkness fully fell, Reverend Miller called everyone together. Lanterns cast warm circles of light as neighbors gathered, holding him books shared between families. Elena's children sat close to Jonah, little Mary leaning sleepily against his side. The first notes of Amazing Grace rose into the evening air, voices joining one by one, until the valley rang with song. Jonah found himself singing too, his deep voice blending with Elena's clear tones beside him. The hymn spoke of being lost and found, of grace freely given words that held new. Meaning now other hymns followed, their familiar verses carrying messages of hope and renewal. Jonah watched the lamplight play across faces, neighbors who had become family, strangers who had become friends. In their eyes, he saw the same truth he was discovering, that true wealth lay not in deeds or dollars, but in the bonds forged. Through shared struggle and celebration, as the evening deepened, folks began saying their goodbyes, promising to return tomorrow to continue the work. Many would camp nearby, unwilling to leave until the barn was finished and the most crucial repairs complete. Their wagons circled the homestead like a protective ring, lanterns glowing softly in the darkness. Jonah walked with Elena to the porch of their home, and he realized he had begun thinking of it as theirs, not just his or hers. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the last neighbors settle in for the night. "Your uncle was wise," Elena said softly. "He knew the land needed more than one pair of hands to make it flourish." Jonah nodded, understanding at last what his inheritance truly meant. It wasn't about the dollar value recorded in the courthouse, or even about the acres of land. It was about responsibility and relationship, about building something larger than himself. "He knew what I needed, too," Jonah admitted, "even if I was too stubborn to see it at first." The night air carried the scent of sage and wood smoke, mingled with the promise of tomorrow's work. From the bedroom window came the sound of children's prayers, a reminder of the family that had grown up around him unawares. The valley lay peaceful under starlight, no longer a burden to be carried alone, but a blessing to be shared. Tomorrow would bring more labor, more challenges to face together, but tonight, watching lamplight dance across Elena's face, Jonah knew with certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The dollar inheritance had led him to something priceless, a family built not on blood, but on choice, a community founded on faith and mutual aid, and a love that had grown slowly and surely as the cottonwood trees that gave the valley its name. The evening breeze rustled through the cottonwoods, carrying the sweet scent of ripening apples across the valley. Jonah Cade settled into his chair on the newly rebuilt porch, its fresh-cut boards still fragrant with pine resin. The setting sun painted the western hills in shades of gold and purple, while crickets began their nightly chorus in the tall grass. Beside him, Elena Yazzi's needle flashed in the fading light as she mended a tear in her son's shirt. The steady rhythm of her stitching matched the peaceful tempo of the evening. Her dark hair caught the last rays of sunlight, and Jonah found himself watching her work, marveling at how much had changed in these past weeks. The children's laughter rang out from beneath the cottonwoods, where tiny lights blinked on and off in the gathering dusk. "Look!" the girl called out, her hands cupped around a captured firefly. "This one's the brightest yet." Her brother darted after another glowing insect, his bare feet silent on the grass. Their shadows stretched long across the yard as they played, carefree and secure in their home. The sight made Jonah's heart swell with an unfamiliar fullness. Irrigation ditches they'd rebuilt gurgled steadily, carrying life-giving water to every corner of the property. The sound reminded Jonah of music, nature's own hymn of gratitude. Those channels had been the first thing they'd restored after the court victory. Understanding that water meant survival in this harsh country, in the orchard, new leaves rustled on the surviving trees. They'd lost some to the railroad men's fire, but most had endured, pushing out fresh growth with stubborn determination. The young saplings they'd planted stood straight and strong between their older cousins, promising future harvests. Jonah closed his eyes, letting the peace of the moment wash over him. Without conscious thought, words of thanksgiving formed in his mind, rising up like steam from summer earth. "Lord," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion, "thank you for my uncle's wisdom, for seeing what I couldn't see back then." The memory of that first day in the judge's office brought a smile to his weathered face. How he'd laughed at the dollar inheritance, thinking it worthless. Now he understood the profound value hidden in that simple bequest, not just land, but purpose, community, and family. "Thank you for your provision," he continued softly, "for bringing us through the fire stronger than before." His calloused hand traced the smooth porch rail. Testament to the neighbors who'd helped rebuild after the railroad's destruction. Elena's needle paused in its work. Jonah felt her eyes on him, no longer sharp with suspicion, as they'd been in those first tense days. The warmth in her gaze reminded him of embers in a hearth, steady and life-giving. When she looked at him now, he saw partnership reflected there. Trust hard-won through shared struggles and victories. She set her sewing aside, folding her hands in her lap. "The evening star is rising," she said quietly, nodding toward the eastern sky where the first bright point of light had appeared. "Makes me think of that first night," Jonah replied, "when I camped here alone, wondering what this place might become, and now." There was a gentle challenge in her voice, but kindness too. Before he could answer, the children came running up the porch steps, their cheeks flushed with play. The boy held his cupped hands out proudly, showing off the firefly. He'd caught its light pulsed steadily, a tiny beacon in the growing darkness. Jonah gestured for them to sit close, and they settled naturally around him, the boy on one side and the girl on the other. The familiar weight of their trust humbled him. These children who had once hidden from his presence now leaned against him without fear. "This valley," he said, his voice carrying clear in the evening stillness. "This is our home, all of us together." He looked at each face in turn. The boy's eager expression, the girl's serious eyes, Elena's quiet smile. "God brought us together here for a purpose, and I aim to honor that purpose every day I draw breath." The firefly in the boy's hands flashed once more before spreading its wings and rising into the darkness. They watched it go, adding its light to the dozens now dancing beneath the cottonwoods inside the house. Lamplight began to glow through the windows, warm and welcoming against the deepening dusk. Elena had hung new curtains last week, their simple pattern transforming the once bare glass into something homely and inviting. The light spilled out across the porch boards, drawing long shadows and turning the rough wood to gold. The girl yawned, curling closer against Jonah's side. Her brother's eyes were growing heavy too, though he fought to keep them open, not wanting to miss anything. Elena rose smoothly, gathering her sewing. "Time for prayers in bed," she said softly. The children knew better than to argue, though. The boy cast one longing look at the fireflies before following his sister inside. Jonah remained on the porch a moment longer, watching the lamp's glow paint squares of light on the yard. That simple illumination spoke volumes of safety, of belonging, of peace hard-won, but finally secured. His uncle's dollar inheritance had transformed into something beyond price, a true home, filled with love and purpose. He could hear Elena's voice inside, leading the children in their bedtime prayers. The familiar words drifted out to him, English and Navajo blending together in a way that felt right and natural, like the meeting of two streams into one stronger river. Rising from his chair, Jonah paused at the door, taking in the valley one. Last time, the moon had risen, casting silver light on the new barn's solid walls and the orchard's reaching branches. Everything they'd rebuilt stood stronger than before. Shaped by shared determination and faith, his dollar inheritance had bought him more than land. It had given him a family to protect, a community to serve, and a purpose to fulfill. As he stepped inside to join the evening prayers, Jonah knew with bone-deep certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The lamplight welcomed him in, warm and steady, a beacon of belonging in the growing night. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but they would face them together. Bound by something stronger than legal documents or blood, the choice to be family, to work the land in partnership, to build a future worthy of his uncles. Vision through the window, fireflies continued their dance beneath the cottonwoods. Nature's own reminder that light could emerge from darkness, and that the simplest gifts often held the greatest value. Inside, surrounded by the family he'd never known he needed, Jonah Cade gave thanks once more for the wisdom that had brought him home. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day. Change your day.